Hi, and welcome to the yet-to-be-named ClanEd Education Podcast. This is the first in the series, and I'm Chris Hutchinson, Head of Learning Design at ClanEd. Today, I'm sitting down with Lisa, and I'm not going to butcher your last name, but Lisa we were introduced almost a year ago around the onset of the unfortunate war in Ukraine, and Lisa has been working here in University of Tampere as a doctoral researcher?
Yes.
Okay. Let's start with a little bit about yourself and your background.
All right. So Lisa Glybchenko is the right way to pronounce my last name. And I work at Tampere University now for 2 years. I'm doing my PhD research, which is about the ways to combine technological innovation and artistic innovation to support peace processes, and it's called Visual Peace Technology. And it is somehow based on and inspired by this initiative that I've been doing for 6 years now, Color Art Peace, and that's what we've been collaborating on with ClanEd as well.
Great. Visual Peace Technology, can you unpack that a little bit? Because this is the first time I've heard the term, and it sounds intriguing, but it also sounds new.
Yeah, it is quite a new thing out there, and it caught my interest about 2020 when everything went online, and also a lot of peace building initiatives. I had been involved in peace building work for around 6 years, also as Color Art Peace has been existing, and then I was somehow partly excited and partly saddened that most of my and a lot of other people's peace building efforts would now be online. But then there was also an opportunity to think about technology mediating our encounters in the peace building sphere too as peace technology, so supporting the efforts and the goals of peace building initiatives instead of just being a medium to facilitate communication or just an application to make our calls happen. So how do we actually integrate it into the design of our peace building project so that it also serves that? And then the visual part of my project, Visual Peace Technology, is about also integrating all kinds of ways in which we could use images for peace specifically. And it's been quite a thing in research to think about visualization technologies and images themselves as something that can facilitate conflict and facilitate violence, also armed violence. But I wanted to look at it in a different way, in a different perspective, and that also comes from my artistic background. I like to do all kinds of visual arts.
Nice. Do you find that there's something about a visual medium that speaks to its ability to instigate either peace or violence that maybe isn't present in written mediums or in other formats? And what would it be?
Well, I think the best way to go about this question is to have a very practical example, and that was something that wasn't a happy thing, but that happened to me, and that kind of, in a sad way, inspired Color Art Peace, and then my whole interest for all these years in both visual and technology aspects of peace building. And that was something that happened in 2014 after my home region in Ukraine, Crimea, was illegally annexed, and I was in mainland Ukraine then, and I had just posted, an artwork of mine on one of my social media channels that I had at the time and don't have anymore. But I would do that a lot, that I would just post my artwork. And then somebody had just commented something on the artwork and then put another comment with like a lot of Russian flags in the comment. And of course, to me, that was very traumatizing because the person knew my position, my pro-Ukrainian position, and the fact that I lost access to my home then. And it felt like they just took my creation, my artwork, and then used it against me by instrumentalizing that platform and the fact that I had posted my artwork there. And I was just back then thinking about how can I protect people's creations that may or may not have anything to do with the topic of the war starting then. And that's why I think the concept of color art piece was created sometime later, and it works so that people specifically submit photographs of what piece is to them, and then I turn them into coloring pages, and the idea that the third person, whoever that may be, would then engage with the original image of piece, the photograph, through the outline to emphasize the elements of piece specifically. And I think it has also been like this in my project, that it's a way for people to connect and to think about the things they don't normally think about. Because if I sort of look back into everything that I remember seeing about other conflict-affected communities, war-affected communities and zones, it always kind of looks the same, grayish photographs and, ruins, or on the contrary, something like red, as in something exploded and something is on fire. And it makes things look all the same in some ways, because, war photography and war reporting are also quite established fields. So I guess they have also certain practices of visualization. But there isn't really something that I know of that is peace photography. And I think it's important to see these islands of peace also in war-affected communities so that you can feel hopeful. Because if you see something that works for peace, and if you get to know about people that support peace also in Ukraine now, then you know whom to support, and you feel empowered. You're like, yes, what can I do for these people, for this initiative? But on the contrary, if you just see a picture of ruins, then you feel all kinds of, I don't even know how to put a word to this, really. But
sorrow, pain,
yes.
choose an adjective of,
Yes.
displeasure. Yeah. So you've done iterations of the project in many places, in many affected communities. Is there anything that stands out to you, or have you started to see, because you talked about this idea that, we have a visual language, let's say, for disaster photography or journalism. There's an angle, and like you said, the colors. So now that you've been working in this and exposed to so much more of it, are you starting to see like a language emerge? Are there commonalities between different communities in the ways that people visualize peace, or what peace means? Is it color? Is it form? Like, have you started to uncover any of this language?
Well, I think I've seen quite a lot of commonalities in what people send. Also, the original photographs, there's a lot about nature, but then I don't really know if the fact that the project is so much also online has an effect on that. Because, of course, if you go on the social media pages of the project and you see so many images of nature, then maybe you're like, oh, that's the image of peace, let me submit something like this. Because also a lot of feedback that I have been getting from participants is that, I've never thought about what an image of peace could be, and is this the right image? And they would send me and like, yes, the right image is what you think it is. I know that it's a bit hard, and I know that we are not really exposed to thinking about these things this way. But something that I've noticed at the later stages of the project, so then when I'm already working on the outlines, and then when people within different kinds of workshops or shorter projects also engage with the outlines, I noticed that when they don't know which photograph and from where it is based on, they can say something like, oh, but there's this thing in my city, for example, if it's a landscape. Or if they would just pick, for example, a coloring page and outline that shows flowers, it's kind of like, it could be anywhere. So when there is this element of not knowing, then it's much easier to connect. And actually last year, my friend and I did a special iteration for that for Ukraine. We did a coloring book and a set of workshops that were called Color Up Ukraine. So we ran a survey for 3 months about how different people in Ukraine, both Ukrainians and foreign citizens of Ukraine, see the regions where they live, and Ukraine as a whole, and peace for Ukraine, and how they understand also freedom and how they want to develop the country as a whole and their regions. And we started it before February last year, and then continued after. So we got responses to that, both before and after the full-scale invasion. But part of the point when we just were thinking about this project in 2021 was to also investigate the effect of Russia's war against Ukraine on the lives of these people, the previous, 8 years of that since 2014. And then we ran these workshops in several countries, and there was this one outline based on a photograph from the city of Bakhmut, which is now very much on the front line. And it looked to many people exactly what I said, like, oh, it could be in my city, it could be somewhere where I have been. And then it's a very, I think, powerful way to see how we are connected and how these concepts and practices of peace and freedom could be challenged for us, and how we need to remember to step up to protect them in different ways.
Yeah. I'm curious if, because you started the project here, just speaking about did you notice a difference in the outputs pre and post the invasion?
Yeah, of course, then the full scale of the invasion affects everybody.
Yeah.
But before, I think the effects were a bit more diffused, and that's also not necessarily the best term to use here, but it's just like a completely different topic to uncover. But yes, so the responses that came after February 24 last year, they were talking about the war in much more direct and specific ways, and just were reflecting on the questions that we had in the survey to a completely, different level. And of course, for both my friend, her name is Vera, she's in Ukraine, both for my friend and I, it was very, in one way traumatic, but in another way also very hopeful to read all of that and to read the stories of people that were very honest, but then also for me to create all the outlines of all these places that I know some of the photographs that were taken, those places might not exist that way anymore if they were bombed, for example. Yeah, so it was a completely different mental process for us to also create this and then go present it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that it was hopeful, because that was another thing that I was wondering was is it hard? Like, I mean, you're working with this very, like, it's a sensitive topic, but you're also trying to bring some beauty to it. And so I imagine that there's a lot of sort of didactic kind of behavior there, and sort of contrary sort of thinking. And I wonder, like, how that affects you, and maybe what changes that might have brought to your perspective, and how you manage, because it must be hard.
Well, to start from the last, how I manage, I don't know. I sometimes wonder how I manage myself. But overall, I think the idea of the project, because it's so personal to me and because it was based on my own experiences of violence and of occupation of my home region, I think I was just trying to create a platform and a set of tools for people to cope with these situations when I didn't really have that platform and those tools when the things happened to me. So then just having that movement from there being nothing to there being at least something is already, I think, growth is already giving hope to me. And then, once that happens to your life, that affects the rest of your life. Like in my case, I was 18 when everything started, and then that changed what I went to study and then what my hobbies became and where that went. Of course, I was trying to use like the skills and the talents that I had before to make a difference, but still where that went is completely influenced by what happened to Ukraine and to me specifically. And then now I think every time I do conduct even just one workshop or a series of workshop, I can see how people also grow, how can they acquire new ways of thinking and new tools, and how they just kind of have a grounding experience of making art. Because I think it's a little bit easier to engage in this activity when you have an outline, and when your task, let's say, is to imbue your own understanding of piece into it and somehow create a collective piece of art, than if you were just given a blank page and you have to create a scratch.
Yeah, of course, like building just challenging enough concept as it is, and circumstances. So it's interesting to find that what that mechanism is that allows people to not draw a blank. If you just put a piece of paper down and ask, like, draw a piece.
Yeah.
Whereas if you can just focus, on the color or your feeling of it. And I guess that kind of brings me, so you've talked about how you can sort of see, during these workshops and through the projects, you can see people's maybe opinions or thoughts change. And then what I'm wondering about, because this is starting to touch on the education and the dialogue of it, or its ability to bring awareness and information, and we can call that education. What do you feel is the possibility of something like the Color Up Peace Project, or like using art as a dialogue builder, specifically between Ukrainians and Russians? Because I've certainly, if we've been following the news, and at least in many of the articles I've read where it's talking to individuals, there's a lot of animosity, understandably, and loss of trust, loss of respect, obviously from Ukrainian citizens and Russian citizens as well. And I think that sometimes there's perhaps we forget that, like, this conflict is really a political conflict, a geopolitical conflict and energy. There's a lot of reasons behind it, but whatever those are, there are still individuals in these countries. And, I've certainly seen reports where, they've been interviewing Ukrainian citizens, and the question is, will you forgive any Russians, or will you be able to have a dialogue with just a Russian citizen? And likewise, I know there's a huge amount of misinformation circulating in Russian media, of course, but I wonder, do you see this as a process that can help repair relations? Suppose when this conflict ends, hopefully soon and in a positive light. So is there a possibility to use things like this? Because I'm sure there's people on all sides hurt, and how can this facilitate that dialogue, so that ordinary people don't hold hate or anger or resentment to other ordinary people who have, for all means and purposes, nothing really to do with what their government decided to do?
Well, within Color Up Peace, I haven't really been working this, like, bringing sides together. I have, it of course started because of what was happening to Ukraine, but I've been mostly working with Ukrainians internally in terms of capacity building and in terms of empowerment, also as community leaders and as peace builders. I've been especially working also with young people who are anyway already driving some sort of change on the ground in Ukraine. So I don't really have any insights on that. But I think what it does to Ukrainians is that, for so many, I think, in my experiences, for so many years and maybe centuries, or for sure centuries also, stories of Ukraine and about Ukraine were told by people other than Ukrainians. They were told by Russian imperialists, and of course they were skewed, and of course it also has a lot of bad effects right now for Ukrainians being misunderstood, also for the war being misunderstood in some ways or in many ways. And what is important, I think, is to give Ukrainians the tools to develop their imagination and break free from these imperial narratives that are actually very hard, I think, to undo completely, because it requires a different kind of investigation into one's own history and also all kinds of cultural things, the visual culture also, what kind of visual language we also have to talk about all different kinds of concepts. So that's what I'm focusing on now. I am not really sure about, side-to-side work and if I would even want to also engage in this, because I am Ukrainian and I do have my own beliefs on this. And limited resources, then need to be very careful with where I put them to.
Of course.
And what kind of effect that has. But, about forgiveness also, because all the different kinds of things that happen in Ukraine that are perpetrated by Russians, all the war crimes, they are also done by somebody who is in some ways a regular citizen, but
that's fair point.
Sent to the army. So it's not just the government in that sense. And there's also, I think, a lot of work for every Russian citizen to do to figure out what kind of imperialist beliefs they have right now also, even if they're not anyway part of the government, and how that hurts other people, not only Ukrainians, but I think the concepts and the practices of freedom and peace everywhere right now, I think it's more than just about Ukraine. And if they were also to do that work separately, then I think there definitely is a lot of space for using visual techniques to also undo their own ways of having and developing visual language of themselves and about the world, also to realize what their space is and what their place is and what their contribution has been. And there has been a lot of very bad contribution. Yes, but I'm not sure that I have the power, or that I would have also the desire to engage in that kind of work. And I think that right now is definitely not a good time to bring, sides together, and even sides in this sense is not really a fitting term in terms of building language, because also a lot of peace building terminology has been developed for post World War II world, where we didn't think that a war like this was going to be possible.
Yeah.
There were many signs that it was going to be possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really about, personally in this context, it seems to me like it's about finding methods to sort of rewrite that shared history and that shared understanding and of what it means to be Ukrainian and these stories you tell, and that's undoing a lot of history.
Yeah,
it's admirable. You said one other thing that I wanted to touch on, which is misinterpretations of the war. Can you speak to that? And because I would like to hear your interpretation of it, since you said it's been misrepresented, and I think that's important to hear.
Yeah, I think what I meant as misrepresentation is that in the beginning, well, not in the beginning of the war, but last February and a couple of months afterwards, I was getting asked these questions, which I thought were very much misinformed and very much were skewing the situation. And I was honestly a lot surprised that I was still getting those questions after all those years of the war. It just seemed to be not in people's attentions or in people's interests.
Sorry, do you have an example of a question?
Yeah, those were questions about how, Ukrainians might have, basically it's a two-side war, that it's an invasion.
Right.
That there's...
It's a reaction to some mystery.
Yeah, so basically we need to look at this, as this is, that there's one aggressor and Ukrainians are defending their country, and they do have the right to also use weapons to defend their country.
Of course.
And that peace talks are not possible in the very beginning or at certain stages, I think they're still not possible because of how basically Russians are not abiding by any laws that apply to these kinds of situations or by any conventions or anything really. So it's making Ukraine or forcing Ukraine internationally, or if international actors were to force Ukraine to go to the negotiation table now and close this, then it would not be peace. It would be just solidifying the terms of Russia's occupation of certain spaces in Ukraine, be it territorial spaces, but also cultural spaces, because this work also against all kinds of imperial narratives has not really been over. So I think the right way to think about the war is to understand that it's up to Ukraine to now, first of all, liberate its territories, but also then figure out what the pillars of peace, as Ukraine sees peace, should be like. So there are certain power relations involved, and I think there's also fault of the international community for the international community to realize, for not reacting to whatever has been happening before February 24 last year, since 2014. And I think we all have a responsibility to change the situation and to also figure out what our place has been in making it this bad.
Yeah, it's heavy.
It is.
So, well, then maybe, how do you see the role of art education, and just education in general as playing a role towards that goal, towards understanding what peace means from a Ukrainian perspective, and maybe for the wider world? How do you see that contributing to this?
Well, my long-term stance has been that peace education should be part of education in general, and also just developing peace literacy to not misunderstand a war like this in the way that I have seen it being misunderstood by non-peace actors, but also by peace actors. And I think what it can do for people individually is to create a sort of lens and a sort of critical space to understand what their place is in their community, and like what their contribution is, to just understand that they are like part, let's say, of a chain and part of a system, and that their actions do influence in certain ways the way we live together as a community and the way we can move forward. And I think that at least this transformation of images that happens in Color Art Peace is a very, you can say it's quite naive, or I've heard this being said, but at the same time, you can also see how this is a very visual and concrete example of how your action can make a difference, because you are literally making a difference to somebody else's vision, to somebody else's outline, and then you see that it's something different. And if the idea is to bring your own understanding of peace, you can see this piece come together. For example, if there's one photograph and one outline that I create, but then 100 people would engage with the same outline to emphasize different pieces of that outline and bring different details of their own understanding of peace, then in the end we have kind of this constellation of what a peace arrangement could be. And I think it's very also useful for as a political tool, in a sense that you then get all this information about what are people's peace values. Of course, it's artistically expressed, and of course it also requires people with certain expertise and certain understanding to then really articulate this into words.
Interpret it. And,
yes.
Yeah.
But then there's, you can make peace very democratic then, because you've asked this number of people in this way that allows their imagination to go in a different direction to express what they may be otherwise not really able to express in words, because, you know, it's hard to...
It's difficult to find words. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say that it's absolutely not naive. I would view it instead as a low threshold, which I think is really important in this. It's a very low threshold way to get to very complex ideas and complex understandings. And like you said, it's interesting to see what we could do moving forward with all of that, how we can interpret that information. And I'd like to ask you about what you think the possibilities are in terms of how we can take this information and collect it and interpret it. But maybe before that, you mentioned peace literacy, and that's another really interesting term. So maybe you could expand on that a little bit, and then we'll go forward.
All right. So to start from peace literacy, there is this, or I've seen in my peace building work for all these years, that there is this very kind of basic understanding that you just can bring different people together and have them talk. And if they just talk in one space that is somehow made safe, which is another thing to question, that they would understand each other and they would be able to coexist. But it's not necessarily that way, because there are power relations involved, there are histories involved, and also like with Ukraine and Russia, there's work that everybody has to do individually to understand how all kinds of Russian imperial legacy has been hurting people since up until now, and still contributes. So there are different power relations involved that first of all need to be understood, and you also, the peace builder that is, let's say, in charge somehow of setting up the space and setting up the interactions and facilitating them, also needs to understand how these histories and how previous interactions and previous sets of power relations make some actors have less tools for communication and also less tools for just imagination, and some would have more, and some would be conditioned to, let's say, go in a certain way along certain discourses that they are exposed to, let's say, on a regular basis. So there are all these different things that one has to make disintegrate, and there are some other things that one has to make accumulate for this space really to be safe and to somehow make people have equal opportunities, or to support one set of actors over another set of actors. But it's, having people come together is a lot of the time like the last or close to the last step of a sound, effective peace building process. But there is much more that needs to happen before. Like for example, needs to be on the side of the oppressor, aggressor, and the party that started the conflict or an act of armed violence. There needs to be a wide and sincere apology, for example. And I haven't, seen that. I haven't seen resistance also to what Russia is doing as a country and as a state on behalf of Russian citizens, much, or especially outside. And also I definitely haven't really heard any apologies. So that makes, and that's in the beginning of the peace building process. So that obviously delays a lot of things.
Further dialogue and moving forward.
Yeah, and all kinds of further steps. But there also needs to be a process of justice. So, punishment of war criminals, and also all kinds of informational campaigns around that for people to build understanding about what actually happened and why it's not okay for that to happen. And also not okay is a very, none of these words apply to the situation because of how grave the situation is, but these are kind of the words that I have right now. Yes. So peace literacy is about understanding the process, what it takes, and what kind of steps there are, and what kind of difficulties there are. And it's also understanding that sometimes it's going to take time. Sometimes there are people who would just refuse to acknowledge their fault and acknowledge their responsibility for being an active citizen and transforming their country, and acknowledging the responsibility of also not doing that and what kind of consequences there are for that, and building some sort of mechanisms for changing that. That requires time, and it was something like a war, and that kind of a horrible war that is happening in Ukraine, it's gonna take, I think, very many years for a sound process to actually happen. And I think peace building process doesn't mean that people who are involved in it and the people who before were in a conflict, armed or not armed, like being into war or not necessarily war, they don't have to be friends ever.
But they do need to respect, I guess,
Yes.
and understand each other.
They need to be able to coexist in the same world without, further violence and without further hurt, but
Be empathetic.
yeah, in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a complicated topic, and I'm really glad that people like you are working on it, because I think that these kind of new thoughts and new approaches and ideas to it are critical to everything that we've just discussed now, and critical to moving forward, not just in this unfortunate conflict between Ukraine and Russia, but in general, in the world. There are countless conflicts out there, and I really hope that this brings to light and some new ideas that can be used to better up the world with color.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think maybe that's a good place to end this. But if you want to tell everyone how they can get in touch with you, if they're interested in what they've heard, or where to follow you, tell them your socials and all of that for more information.
Yes, so you can search a Color Art Piece on Instagram and on Facebook. And then if you message, there will be me on the other side. And I guess we can also put some links.
Yep.
Yeah,
You can get in touch with Clanet to join the Color Up Peace program and make your contributions.
Yes, and if you would want to join the course, also there's a sign-up Google form, which would come to me, and then I would send you an email with how to join the course.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yay.